Welcome back to another episode of the CSK8 podcast. My name is Jared O'Leary. Each week of this podcast alternates between an interview with a guest or multiple guests and a solo episode where I unpack some scholarship. In this week's particular episode, I am unpacking the paper titled The Role of Deliberate Practice in the Acquisition of Expert Performance, and this was written by K. Anders Ericsson, Rolf Krampe, and Clemens Tesch-Römer, and apologies if I mispronounced any names. As always, you can find links in the show notes, which you can visit by clicking on the link in your app that you're listening to this on, or by simply going to jaredoleary.com and go into the podcast tab. In the show notes, if you click on the author's last name, you will go to their Google Scholar profile, so you can read more papers by them, or you can click on the title of this particular article, and it'll send you directly to a PDF of the paper, so you can read it, which I highly recommend you do, because I'm not able to talk about everything in this particular episode. All right, so here's the abstract for this paper. Quote, "The theoretical framework presented in this article explains expert performance as the end result of individuals' prolonged efforts to improve performance while negotiating motivational and external constraints. In most domains of expertise, individuals begin in their childhood, a regime of effortful activities, deliberate practice, designed to optimize improvement. Individual differences, even among elite performers, are closely related to assessed amounts of deliberate practice. Many characteristics once believed to reflect innate talent are actually the result of intense practice extended for a minimum of 10 years. Analysis of expert performance provides unique evidence of the potential and limits of extreme environmental adaptation and learning." End quote. All right, so if I were to summarize this paper into a single sentence, I would say that this paper debunks the notion of innate abilities within a domain, and it describes the role of deliberate practice in achieving expert performance. Okay, so why am I talking about this in a computer science education podcast? So one of the benefits that CS educators might have is if you work across multiple grade levels, you're able to take an approach to developing expertise over the long term rather than just for a quarter, a semester, or a year that some teachers have. So for example, when I worked in the K-8 school that I previously worked at in Avondale, one of the things that I considered was, how do I help kids develop expertise from kindergarten all the way through 8th grade in computer science? So if you are working with grade levels, this is something that might really help you and the kids that you work with. So rather than teaching concepts for supposed mastery within a semester or a year, we as a field should really think about how our learning experiences help kids develop expertise in computer science over decades. Now, deliberate practice is the framework that inspired Malcolm Gladwell's book, Outliers. And in that book, Gladwell discusses what he calls the 10,000 hour rule. However, many people don't actually realize that he's citing Ericsson's work. So like this paper and some other works by Ericsson, and some of the other scholars that are cited in this publication. Also, one of the things of note is that the 10,000 hour rule is not actually a rule. It's an average that changes for each domain. So some domains it's around 8,000, other domains it's actually around 20,000. Now, this has been a particular interest of mine for many years. So one of the reasons why is because I started making music in 8th grade. And I was just kind of okay at it. Got some lessons, didn't really do anything great with it. My freshman year of high school, I was in the marching band, and I had a part where I was literally just supposed to keep the beat to the music on a cowbell. And I was so bad at it that I could not just keep a straight beat. Just literally doing that. So they cut that part for me, and I didn't get to play that part. I had to play other stuff that apparently was easier. However, by my sophomore year, I became first chair of every ensemble, and by my senior year, I received a full ride in percussion performance. So one of the reasons why I'm interested in this area is because I was curious, why was I able to excel at that rate, while my peers, who were also interested in making music, were not? Now, it turns out that my escape from suicidal thoughts likely ended up leading to a healthy coping mechanism in the form of practicing music as much as possible to escape those thoughts. Because I was constantly practicing, I was able to increase my abilities as a performer. To further kind of like understand this process, I started to study sports psychology during my undergrad and just as electives, and then dove deeper into this topic in my master's. After I actually got into the research on this side of things, like reading Ericsson's works and a bunch of other people on this, I went out and tried to apply the concepts from what I learned in my own learning and my own facilitating or teaching with kids. And it works really well. But I have to say it is not at all easy to do. So what I'm hoping is that this particular podcast provides a framework for considering how to develop your own expertise and the expertise of kids that you work with. All right, so let's get into the article itself. So this article begins with a brief history of the views of talent and expert performance. So for example, discussing Sir Francis Galton's view that high performance in an area was due to innate capacities, which, fun fact, Sir Francis Galton is a cousin, I believe, of Charles Darwin. Now, this view of the innate capacities or abilities has continued up to the time of this publication, which was 1993, and even modern day in some areas. So, for example, it was thought that people had innate memory capacities or neurotransmission speeds that could not be improved through training and practice alone. However, research in those areas have found that, quote, experts are faster and more accurate than less accomplished individuals. However, experts' superior speed and their domain of expertise does not transfer to general tests of speed, end quote. And that, quote, experts' memory for representative stimuli from their domain is vastly superior to that of lesser experts, especially for briefly presented stimuli. But when tested on randomly rearranged versions of representative stimuli from their domain presented with short exposures or on materials outside of their domain, the memory of experts is no better than that of ordinary individuals. The domain-specific nature of experts' superior performance implies that acquired knowledge and skill are important to attainment of expert performance, end quote. So both of those quotes are from page 365. So in other words, even in areas where many people for many years have considered that you cannot improve, like how fast your brain processes things or your memory, there have been studies that have shown that you actually can, and that is domain specific and is a result of intentional practice. Now, Ericsson and the other authors don't completely rule out heritable traits, as some sports and activities favor heritable traits such as height. So for example, basketball. However, you can still be really good at dribbling and shooting, etc., while playing basketball, even if you are not tall. So the next section of the paper discusses whether or not experience within a domain correlates to maximal performance. So for example, is a teacher who's been teaching for 30 years inherently going to be better than a teacher who's only been teaching for 10 years? Now, the authors would argue, no. It depends on the amount of feedback and the actual amount of effort went into improving your performance over time as an educator. So as some examples in the paper, they mention some examples of changes in world records for Olympic events, significant changes over time, and world records in general, and other domains that have been systematically measured or evaluated in the past couple of centuries, like music, chess, etc. Here's a quote from page 366. Quote, in virtually all domains, insights and knowledge are steadily accumulating, and the criteria for eminent as well as expert performance undergo continuous change. To reach the status of an expert in a domain, it is sufficient to master the existing knowledge and techniques. To make an eminent achievement, one must first achieve the level of an expert, and then, in addition, surpass the achievements of already recognized eminent people and make innovative contributions to the domain. In sum, the belief that a sufficient amount of experience or practice leads to maximal performance appears incorrect, end quote. So the next section of the paper addresses the belief that people with innate abilities are able to achieve expert levels of performance much faster and with less effort than people without such innate abilities. However, they point out studies in chess, music, mathematics, tennis, swimming, long-distance running, and other domains that most experts take at least 10 years of deliberate practice to become an expert in a domain. In addition, people who start at young ages in domains such as music, poetry, or even science still tend to take an average of 10 years to refine their expertise. And if you're thinking of videos that have gone viral of young musicians playing complicated material, they tend to be great for their age in terms of technical ability, but not an expert when compared to outside of their age group. So here's a quote from the paper from page 369. Quote, in the performance of music, children and adolescents are judged principally on their technical proficiency. Expert adult performers, however, are judged on their interpretation and ability to express emotions through music. The ability of many child prodigies in music to succeed as adult musicians is often attributed to difficulties making this transition, possibly resulting from inappropriate training and instruction during the early and mid phases of music training. To become outstanding musicians at the international level, individuals have to contribute unique interpretations of music, end quote. Okay, so while kids might be able to achieve technical abilities, they still have to put in the time to develop those technical abilities, and a lot of time. And if you're thinking, yeah, but what about Mozart? Here's some context for you. Mozart's dad was considered to be an excellent music teacher who dedicated a lot of time teaching Mozart when he was a toddler. In addition, Mozart was obsessive about making music. So he became good at a young age because he was always making music and had guidance from his father, who was a well-known music pedagogue. And for context, I've had the privilege of working with children who might be considered prodigious and adults who are considered to be some of the best in their domain at what they do. Every single one of them spent countless hours refining their craft in different ways. In order to become an expert in that area, you have to practice. And it's a lot of practice. So here's a summary quote from page 366. Quote, "We have shown that expert performance is acquired slowly over a very long time as a result of practice, and that the highest levels of performance and achievement appear to require at least around 10 years of intense prior preparation." End quote. So the authors end this introduction by arguing there's not enough research on how to develop expertise through practice, so the remainder of the paper kind of describes how to do it through something they call deliberate practice. Okay, so a quick summary of the introduction. So they provide a brief history of the idea of expertise or talent or innate abilities. They summarize some of the research behind the idea that abilities are in fact not innate. And then they argue that we need to have some research that shows, well, how our abilities developed over time. All right, so now getting into deliberate practice. So here are some of the characteristics. The first one is motivation to participate in the domain and to improve performance over an extended period of time, like years. The next characteristic is the activity needs to take into account where the participant is at in that moment. So it can't be too hard, it can't be too easy. It needs to be in that like Goldilocks zone. The next characteristic is that participants should receive immediate feedback or knowledge of how they did. So without being able to refine practices through in-the-moment feedback, participants are not likely to improve over extended periods of times. They'll just be guessing. And the last characteristic is that the participants need to be able to repeatedly perform the task, whether it's the same task or something that is similar. So what does this mean for computer science education? So the first thing is that we need to find ways to motivate kids to want to learn over an extended period of time. We can't expect kids to become an expert in coding or computer science after just a quarter, a year, whatever. Now, the best approach that I have found is to start with students' interests and have many avenues for engagement. Another thing that we need to consider is we need to design experiences or spaces with resources that allow kids to explore and learn in increasingly complex ways that align with their current abilities. Kids are going to come in with different experiences with computers and computer science, and as they're learning it, they're going to have more opportunities inside or outside of school, or less opportunities than their peers. So we need to have a range of resources that accounts for these different skills or understandings. Another thing that we need to consider is that kids need to receive immediate feedback from computer science facilitators, peers, or software to help with continuous refinement. They can't just work on something and then a month later actually get some feedback on it. So for example, can't just write code for a program and then a month later press the compile button and see if it actually works. You need to be able to constantly receive feedback on what's working and what needs improvement, such as through debugging. And kids need to be able to repeatedly apply their understandings in interesting and meaningful ways that assist with sustaining engagement over an extended period of time. Now, one of the things I've mentioned in the podcast repeatedly is trying to work with kids one-on-one rather than teaching to a group or to a mean of the group. So here's a quote from page 367 that talks about the importance of this. Quote, "Although it is possible to generate curricula and use group instruction, it is generally recognized that individualized supervision by a teacher is superior. Research in education, reviewed by Bloom, shows that when students are randomly assigned to instruction by a tutor or to conventional teaching, tutoring yields better performance by 2 standard deviations. The average tutored student performed at the 98th percentile of students taught with the conventional method. Interestingly, the correlation between prior achievement and achievement on the current course was reduced and correspond to only about 6% of the variance of the tutored students, as compared with around 36% for students taught with conventional methods." End quote. So in other words, working with kids one-on-one works much better than working with kids in a group and not being able to provide that individualized feedback. Now, since reading this research and trying to apply it into my own life, one of the things I needed to consider is how should there be a balance between deliberate practice and a balance between play, inquiry, experimentation, etc. In the K-8 spaces that I particularly worked on, I prefer to focus on play, inquiry, experimentation, and just cultivating motivation or enjoyment within the field. One of the reasons for this is because I'm trying to build off the interests of the kids that I'm working with, and if I were to immediately jump into deliberate practice with kids, they would likely want to quit or lose interest in CS education, or whatever domain I'm facilitating. So here's a quote that elaborates on this. This quote is from page 368. Quote, "In contrast to play, deliberate practice is highly structured activity, the explicit goal of which is to improve performance. Specific tasks are invented to overcome weaknesses, and performance is carefully monitored to provide cues for ways to improve it further. We claim that deliberate practice requires effort and is not inherently enjoyable. Individuals are motivated to practice because practice improves performance. In addition, engaging in deliberate practice generates no immediate monetary rewards and generates costs associated with access to teachers and training environments. Thus, an understanding of the long-term consequences of deliberate practice is important, end quote. So in other words, deliberate practice can be exhausting. Although I've worked with many kids and adults who are interested in engaging in deliberate practice in a particular domain, most people are unwilling or uninterested in the actual amount of time it takes, and the amount of money, and the amount of effort that can actually go into developing expertise over many years. Okay, so the authors note that there are 3 requirements of deliberate practice. So here's the first one from page 368. Quote, first, deliberate practice requires available time and energy for the individual as well as access to teachers, training material, and training facilities, the resource constraint. If the individual is a child or adolescent, someone in the individual's environment must be willing to pay for training material and the time of professional teachers, as well as for transportation to and from training facilities and competitions. End quote. Here's the second requirement from pages 368 and 369. Quote, second, engagement in deliberate practice is not inherently motivating. Performers consider it instrumental in achieving further improvements in performance. Motivational constraint. The lack of inherent reward or enjoyment in practice as distinct from the enjoyment of the result or improvement is consistent with the fact that individuals in a domain rarely initiate practice spontaneously. End quote. And here's the final requirement from page 369. Quote, finally, deliberate practice is an effortful activity that can be sustained only for a limited time each day during extended periods without leading to exhaustion. Effort constraint. To maximize gains for long-term performance, individuals must avoid exhaustion and must limit practice to an amount from which they can completely recover on a daily or weekly basis, end quote. Now, in each one of these quotes, they mentioned some constraints, the resource constraint, the effort constraint, and the motivational constraint. I'll talk a little bit more about those in a moment. Now, when engaging in expertise acquisition, they argue that there are 3 phases to this. So the first phase is beginning with an introduction to the domain. So for example, hour of code or a computer science class. That's getting your feet wet into it. The next phase for expertise acquisition is when deliberate practice begins. So intentionally setting forth to try and improve your abilities in understanding over time. And the third phase starts when a person strives for improvement within a domain full time. Now, having worked with every grade, kindergarten through graduate students at a university, it's interesting to think about which phase a person might be in within a domain, given the age that you're working with. So for example, most of the K-8 kids I worked with were in phase 1. Many of the high school kids I worked with were in phase 2, and many of the undergrad and graduate students were in phase 3. However, that's a generalization, as I've seen each phase across different grades and age groups. Okay, so now that we know the characteristics and requirements for deliberate practice, and we know what the phases are, what are some of the constraints that prevent people from all becoming experts in a domain? So the first one is a resource constraint. To engage in deliberate practice, it often requires a lot of time and money for parents to help kids attend practices or purchase equipment, pay for lessons or coaches, etc. And this directly relates to some equity issues in terms of who has access to engage in deliberate practice. So for example, a student who cannot afford private lessons and has to work an after-school job is not going to be able to put in as much time as a student who can pay for one-on-one instruction and has the luxury of being able to practice rather than having to work a minimum wage job. This is one of the factors of why I was able to excel over some of my peers, because I did not have to work. I had that privilege, and all I had to do when I got home was practice. So as a musician, I was able to accelerate at a faster rate than my peers who had to work jobs and who had to engage in activities that prevented them from being able to practice. Or some of my friends who did not have the money to afford private lessons to improve their performance. Okay, so the next constraint is the effort constraint. So it takes a lot of time and energy to engage in deliberate practice. So here's a quote from page 370. Quote, "The limited duration of practice is the best evidence of the effort it requires. When individuals, especially children, start practicing in a given domain, the amount of practice is an hour or less per day. Similarly, laboratory studies of extended practice limit practice to about 1 hour for 3 to 5 days a week." End quote. And a little bit further, here it's picking up the quote again. Quote, "Studies show essentially no benefit from durations exceeding 4 hours per day and reduced benefits for practices exceeding 2 hours. End quote. So in other words, yeah, you could put in 10 hours a day if you wanted to, but you're going to have diminishing returns after only a couple or a few hours. So you might be able to work on your stamina, but you are likely not improving. And if anything, you might be regressing in your abilities and could lead to injury, exhaustion, burnout, etc. One of the reasons why is because when engaging in deliberate practice, it is recommended that individuals are fully attentive in their own practices. And without having enough time to rest or recover between that's when it can cause the exhaustion, fatigue, injuries, etc. Quote, in summary, disregard of the effort constraint on deliberate practice leads to injury and even failure. In the short term, optimal deliberate practice maintains equilibrium between effort and recovery. In the long term, it negotiates the effort constraints by slow, regular increases in amounts of practice that allow for adaptation to increased demands. End quote. It's from page 371. All right, and the third constraint is motivational constraint. Quote, interested individuals need to be engaged in the activity and motivated to improve performance before they begin deliberate practice. End quote. It's from page 371. This is one of the reasons why I focus so much on interest-driven learning. Having personally put deliberate practice to the test in multiple domains, like music, computer science, I can attest to how difficult it is to sustain intense engagement over multiple years. Without the motivation, you'll likely get burned out and lose interest in the subject matter, which is something that schools are honestly particularly good at doing. They're really good at burning kids out. Think of the TED Talk by the late Sir Ken Robinson. Okay, so quick summary of the constraints. So we have constraints around resources, effort, and motivation. If you do not have the resources, do not have the effort, and do not have the motivation, you likely will not be able to obtain expert performance. So these are 3 things that we need to consider when we're working with kids if we are trying to help them become experts within a domain like computer science. Okay, so the next big chunk of the paper is 2 studies that highlight the role of deliberate practice in expert performance. I highly recommend reading through the paper to get the details of those findings, but a basic summary is that, quote, elite performers spend much time on deliberate practice, and in those cases in which amount of weekly deliberate practice has been recorded, high level of performance is associated with higher levels of deliberate practice at the same age, end quote. From page 390, and another quote from page 390. Quote, the structure of training programs in virtually any domain adapts the deliberate practice activities to suit the level of current performance. Increased complexity and proficiency of acquired skills and characteristics leads to increased performance and allows for engagement in more challenging, deliberate practice activities for a longer period of time, end quote. In other words, it gets increasingly complex over time, and you'll be able to practice more over an extended period of time. And here's one more summary quote from these studies from page 392. Quote, across many domains of expertise, a remarkably consistent pattern emerges. The best individuals start practice at earlier ages and maintain a higher level of daily practice. Moreover, estimates indicate that at any age, the best individuals in quite different domains, such as sports and music, spend similar amounts of time on deliberate practice. In virtually all domains, there is evidence that the most important activity, practice, thinking, or writing, requires considerable effort and is scheduled for a fixed period during the day. For those exceptional individuals who sustain this regular activity for months and years, its duration is limited to 2 to 4 hours a day, which is a fraction of their time awake, end quote. All right, so listening to that quote and some of the other stuff I've been talking about, you may have been thinking some of the ethics behind deliberate practice. Here's a quote from page 393 that is a little long, but is really worth considering. Quote, in the current system with age-matched evaluation of performance, it is impossible for an individual with less accumulated practice at some age to catch up with the best individuals who have started earlier and maintain maximum levels of deliberate practice, not leading to exhaustion. As noted earlier, the amount of possible practice appears to slowly increase with accumulated practice and skill. Hence, individuals intent on catching up may suddenly increase the amount of deliberate practice to the level or even above the level of the best performers. Within months, these individuals are likely to encounter overuse injuries and exhaustion and may terminate their engagement in their domain, convinced that the best performers are qualitatively different. Furthermore, the difference in accumulated deliberate practice in late adolescent for the good and best violinists is remarkably large, and to eliminate this difference, the good violinist would need to practice an additional 5 hours per week beyond the current optimal level of weekly practice for more than 8 full years, end quote. Okay, so how does this relate to CS education or education in general? So what it's saying is, if we have kids who are starting to learn how to code, maybe in kindergarten, maybe they spend an hour a week, or in kindergarten, then first grade, maybe they spend 2 hours a week, etc. By the time they get to 8th grade, if you have an 8th grader who has never coded before and is just getting started, it would be nearly impossible for them to catch up with the students who have had kindergarten through 8th grade working on this skill. So the idea of CS for all and starting early becomes an ethical consideration when only some schools offer this and other schools do not. So if we look at this from an ethical and expertise acquisition or skill acquisition lens, it's problematic when schools don't offer a particular subject area, if we think that subject area is important to engage in and become an expert in. All right, so the next big chunk of the paper is a general discussion. There's a lot of content in this particular section, and I'm going to briefly summarize only some of it. Again, I highly recommend reading this actual paper and thinking of the implications in your own life and in your own teaching or facilitating. So one of the sections kind of addresses what some of you might be thinking. You might be thinking, yeah, but X person has Y physical characteristics that helps them with a particular domain. While that is true, these are more than likely a result of intense practicing, other than like height or something like that. So here's an example. So intense practicing over prolonged periods of time can result in cognitive adaptations, genetic adaptations, neurological adaptations, perceptual motor adaptations, physiological adaptations, psychomotor adaptations, and more. The authors highlight some examples, but I've also read other studies in various sports psychology, medicine, and other journals to confirm these adaptations. So if you have a fixed mindset about your own abilities or the abilities of the kids that you work with, check out these studies for some examples of growth that I honestly didn't even know was possible until I started reading it and applying these in different contexts. So the next section of the general discussion, the authors discuss the apparent innate talent in children and savants and found that, quote, exceptional abilities observed in children and idiot savants are consistent with all the characteristics of acquired skills. Most of them can be easily acquired by adults through known training methods, although some of them may be more easily acquired during childhood. The motivational factors that lead children and idiot savants to focus their time and energy on activities that improve performance are still poorly understood, end quote, from page 396. And apologies for using the word idiot, that was a direct quote. So this finding relative to savantism has been found in many other studies that I've looked into. So for example, calendrical savants are individuals who can, like you say, what day of the week was January 3rd, 1912? And they'll be able to, like, very fast tell you what day of the week that was. So calendrical savants actually engage in obsessive practice, memorizing formulas for these dates. So it's not like they were just born all of a sudden with an infinite calendar in their brain. They regularly practice this and are constantly thinking about memorize formulas for remembering dates. So next, the authors discuss how it can be difficult to measure and predict performance when it takes about a decade of intense practice to achieve expert results. So if we want to actually look at expertise in computer science, we need to actually engage in longitudinal studies. We can't just be like, oh, well, we did this intervention for a week and they learned and they increased from a 3 out of 5 to a 4.5 out of 5. Look at us, this is amazing, now they're experts. No, we need to actually look at stuff over decades of time to see how people are actually learning these things over multiple years. All right, so here are a couple of quotes that kind of summarize the overall paper and conclude it. So here's a quote from page 399. Quote, we reject any important role of innate ability. It is quite plausible, however, that heritable individual differences might influence processes related to motivation and the original enjoyment of the activities in the domain, and even more important, affect the inevitable differences in the capacity to engage in hard work, deliberate practice, end quote. And here's one more quote from page 400. Quote, it does not follow from the rejection of innate limits on acquired performance that everyone can easily attain high levels of skill. Contemporary elite performers have overcome a number of constraints. They have obtained early access to instructors, maintained high levels of deliberate practice throughout development, received continued parental and environmental support, and avoided disease and injury. When one considers, in addition, the prerequisite motivation necessary to engage in deliberate practice every day for years and for decades, when most children and adolescents of similar ages engages in play and leisure, the real constraints of the acquisition of expert performance becomes apparent. The commitment to deliberate practice distinguishes the expert performer from the vast majority of children and adults who seem to have remarkable difficulty meeting the much lower demands of practice in schools, adult education, and in physical exercise programs." End quote. All right, so that's kind of a main summary of some of the findings in this particular paper. Again, there are 2 studies embedded within this that I very briefly summarized the findings from, and there's a lot more content in here that provides examples and dives into the nitty-gritty. Like, you might be thinking, well, yeah, well, what about the familial dynasties like the Bach family? Like, they were all great musicians, blah, blah, blah. Well, they actually talk about that. So I highly recommend reading it, which, again, you can find in the show notes. Just click on the title of the article in the show notes. Okay, as always in these Unpacking Scholarship episodes, I like to share some of my lingering questions or thoughts. So one of them is, are we, as CS educators, designing classes, experiences, or curricula that develop expertise, or are we developing general knowledge? Depending on how you answer that is going to determine a completely different approach to what you should take in the classroom. If you are going to engage in deliberate practice, what kind of balance should we strive for between play and deliberate practice? Especially if we are saying that everybody should learn computer science education. Well, what about those who are not interested in deliberate practice? That will likely burn them out. Maybe we should engage and play with them. But the ones who are interested in diving deep into CS education, how can we provide deliberate practice opportunities for them in our classes? So while I have previously mentioned how scholars like Resnick, Russ, Kafai, Pepler, etc. focus on play and how that really resonates with me, the sustained engagement within a domain that motivates children doesn't necessarily guarantee kids will become experts within the domain without striving to continually improve their abilities through something like deliberate practice. So this is one of the reasons why I encourage kids to engage in ipsative assessment practices to assess their current understandings in relation to prior understandings, and to then set their own goals for what they wanted to learn next. So if they weren't forging new paths or creative applications of their understandings, then I'd sit down with them and help them brainstorm new ways to challenge themselves to dive deeper in the areas that they are interested in. So for example, a group of middle schoolers were making variations upon maze games in Scratch, and every time they finished one, I'd ask, what are you going to work on next? And then they'd be like, oh, I want to create another maze game, but we're going to make it slightly different. And so they weren't really pushing themselves as hard as they could. So after a couple variations on maze games, I just sat down with them and went, okay, how can you challenge yourself to do something new and different? So you weren't just doing the same thing over and over. So they were having fun, but they were also diving deeper into what they were doing. Now, that being said, my intense focus on play in the classroom can lead to lifelong engagement without necessarily developing expertise in the domain. So yeah, kids might have enjoyed my class, but it doesn't necessarily mean they actually obtained expertise within computer science over multiple years. They may have just realized, yeah, I enjoy this thing, it's fun, cool, but I'm not going to become an expert in it. However, I would argue that a premature focus on deliberate practice can lead many to burnout within a domain if they aren't willing to engage in the drudgery of increasing their own performance. So if I had forced deliberate practice on kids that I was working with, many of them likely would have not enjoyed computer science. So you have to figure out your own balance between play and deliberate practice in the classes and experiences you facilitate. So another question that I have is, if deliberate practice can only be sustained for a limited amount of time each day, when should students engage in deliberate practice? So for example, which domains or subject areas should they focus on, and why those over others? If we need to limit deliberate practice so there's time for recovery, what does that mean about how we structure in-school and out-of-school time? So for example, how much homework should kids have, and how frequently should kids engage in homework? How many breaks throughout the day should kids have in between classes? Many Olympians and expert performers sleep more than people who are non-experts. One of the reasons why is because they take naps in the middle of the day. Do we need to include nap time if we're going to structure school around developing expertise? I don't know. And speaking of, so if deliberate practice has requirements for rest between sessions, how can we model and support rest between learning experiences? Should there be more recess? Should there be a nap time? Should there be days off in between intense work days? Here's a quote from page 391. Quote, "When expert performers make a full-time commitment to the domain, our studies show that they spend between 50 and 60 hours per week on domain-related activities. Less than half of that time, about 25 hours per week, is spent on deliberate practice, and this time is distributed across the entire week in practice sessions of limited duration." End quote. In other words, if you're listening to this and like, wow, deliberate practice is awesome, I'm going to do this 8 hours a day every single day of the week, that's not going to go well for you or the kids that you work with. So schedule in that time for rest. Another question that I have is, which phase of deliberate practice are the students you work with, and how does or doesn't your class align with those phases? So are they in the introduction phase? Are they in the deliberate practice phase? Or are they in the phase of full-time engagement in deliberate practice? If you're a K-8 teacher, you might be in phase 1. If you're in high school, you might be in phase 2. If you're working with undergrad or graduate students, you're probably in phase 3 with the students that you're working with. Now, that being said, another ethical thing to ponder. If it takes about 10 years to become an expert in a domain, what does that say about the ethics of having new teachers working with students? Is it ethical to have a first-year teacher working with students without much support? Students in that class likely will not receive as good instruction as somebody who has been doing this for multiple decades and engaging in deliberate practice around their pedagogy. Another ethical question is, what about the ethics of grades based on performance? For example, is it fair to be graded on a curve when somebody like myself could go home and practice every day for multiple hours, whereas some of my peers did not have private instruction in music, did not have the ability to practice at home because they had to work multiple jobs in high school, etc.? Was it fair for them to be assessed on their performance abilities compared to somebody like myself who had many other advantages and privileges? I'd argue no, but it's something that we should talk about, is if we are actually developing expertise and we're taking into account all these things that we need to consider that impact the development of expertise, grades might be an unethical measurement that we use in classes if we're basing it on performance. Think of the kids who are able to go home and work on their projects, and think of the kids who don't have access to internet or devices at home. To grade based on performance is unethical when some kids are able to go home and continue to refine their abilities and other kids are not. All right, so those are some of my lingering questions and thoughts. I know I had a lot of them on this one. Again, this has heavily influenced my own thinking in education and the way this is that I learn. So I highly recommend checking out the show notes in the app that you're listening to this on, or going to jaredoleary.com and reading the actual paper by clicking on it in the show notes. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. I hope you stay tuned next week for another interview, and 2 weeks from now for another Unpacking Scholarship episode. And if you'd be so kind, please consider sharing this with somebody or providing a review on whatever platform you're listening to this on. I hope you're all staying safe and are having a wonderful week.